Trapped and alone in the wilderness. Can the stranger save her before it's too late? What if love was the universe's most dangerous secret? What if, somewhere beyond the stars, there was a force so powerful that it could change the fate of entire worlds? A force so alien, so unimaginable, that when it reaches us, it threatens not just our lives but the very essence of what it means to be human. But imagine this: one night, a simple message breaks the silence. It's not from someone you know. It's not even from Earth. It's from a being who doesn't just look like you. A being whose existence defies everything you believe is possible. And in that moment, everything changes. This message, this signal, isn't just a call. It's an invitation, a chance to discover something beyond your wildest dreams, or nightmares. The question isn't if you'll answer, but how you'll survive the answer. Are you ready to find out what lies beyond the stars? Because this isn't just another love story, it's a cosmic journey where the line between love and destruction blurs. Where one decision could send everything spiraling into the unknown. Is love truly universal? Or is it the ultimate weapon that could tear everything apart? Stay with us till the end to discover the truth. And if you want to keep exploring these cosmic questions, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Intergalactic Hearts is just beginning, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. You'll want to be one of the first to join this journey. Cassius stood at the edge of the canyon, gazing into the orange-tinted horizon. The winds of the desolate desert planet whipped around him, carrying with them the scent of dust and metal. This place was far from home, a dry, barren landscape where survival was a constant struggle. His boots scraped against the rocky surface, a sound almost swallowed by the endless wind. For 12 days, he had been alone, fixing solar relay stations and keeping the power grid online. It was simple work, the kind that didn't ask for much other than time and patience. But it wasn't peace. He'd heard the stories about Salve, about the alien ruins buried deep in the canyon. No one had ever found them, at least, not that he knew. All Cassius had were the whispers from the few who had come before him, the ones who didn't return. Then came the cry. At first, he thought it was the wind. But then it came again, more distinct. It was human, or at least, he thought it was. Cassius paused, heart racing slightly. This place wasn't supposed to have any life beyond scavengers and the occasional creature. He looked at his sensor pad, half-heartedly checking for any signs of life. There was nothing. Still, the sound echoed through the canyon, a thin, high-pitched cry that tugged at something inside him. It wasn't his job to get involved. He wasn't here to rescue anyone. Yet, despite every instinct telling him to keep walking, to keep working, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. He descended the narrow ridge carefully, the solace of his boots scraping against the sharp stone beneath him. His gaze scanned the horizon, scanning for any signs of movement. Then, he saw it. A shape, twisted in agony, caught in a trap. His heart lurched as he rushed to the figure. The creature before him wasn't like anything he had seen before. It was humanoid, but far too alien to be human. She had skin the color of soft pink, glowing faintly beneath the dim light. Her eyes were enormous, bright purple, catching the last of the sun's rays as she looked up at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Her hair, long and white, shimmered in the light like it was made of starlight, flowing in waves that seemed to defy the harsh winds around them. Without thinking, Cassius dropped to his knees, hands shaking slightly as he worked to free her from the trap. His fingers brushed against her smooth skin as he cut the metal coils, and a sudden jolt of warmth ran through his chest. "Easy," he murmured, trying to keep his voice steady. Her gaze didn't leave him, though there was no fear in her eyes, only something deeper, more profound. You're not one of them," she said, her voice soft, almost melodic, like the sound of wind chimes in the distance. Cassius paused, blinking in confusion. "No," he said slowly, "I'm not." Her lips curved into a faint, unreadable smile, and Cassius felt a strange heat rise in his chest. "You're not alone," she said, her gaze locked onto his as though she was trying to read him. Cassius swallowed hard, his heart beating faster now. "I'm not sure about that," he replied quietly. He stepped back, pulling her to her feet. For a brief moment, their bodies brushed together, her warmth, her energy, everything about her was magnetic. Cassius felt a connection, an electricity between them. It wasn't just the physical touch. It was something more. He didn't know what it was, but something deep inside him told him he couldn't just walk away from this. Cassius kept his eyes on Lyra as she stepped carefully beside him, her movements fluid, almost ethereal. Her presence, though calm and composed, carried a certain weight, one that was both soothing and disarming. He couldn't ignore the way she carried herself. There was a grace to her, a quiet strength that came with the way she walked, every step deliberate but light. It was as though she had always known her place in this world, and that knowledge gave her a power that was both unsettling and intoxicating. Cassius hadn't expected to feel anything for her, certainly not this soon. But every glance, every fleeting touch between them, stirred something in him that he hadn't realized had been dormant for so long. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was more than just her appearance. It was the way her eyes locked onto his with such intensity. The way her voice, soft and melodic, seemed to send ripples through his chest. It was almost like she could see right through him, like she knew every fear, every longing he had ever had, even without speaking. "What brought you here, Lyra?" he asked, his voice breaking the comfortable silence between them. Her gaze flicked to him, though she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stopped walking, letting the wind carry the silence between them. The orange glow of the twin suns made her skin glow softly, as if she were made of the very light that bathed the desert. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, but she hesitated. "Why are you so curious?" she finally asked, her voice laced with something that might have been amusement or something else. "I don't know." Cassius shrugged, though his heart raced with an unspoken question. "Maybe because I'm tired of being alone." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, she seemed to understand. She looked away, her gaze far off into the horizon. "You're not alone," she said quietly. "You just haven't found what you're looking for yet." Cassius wasn't sure what to say to that, so he simply stayed silent, walking alongside her. He could feel the warmth of her presence beside him, the subtle pull that seemed to draw him in, though he couldn't quite explain why. Her every movement seemed to flow effortlessly with the harshness of the planet. Everything about her was an enigma, and for some reason, it felt like she was the answer to something he hadn't even known he was searching for. They walked for hours in silence, the only sound being the rhythmic crunch of their boots against the rocky ground. The winds had calmed, leaving a strange stillness in the air. It was a peaceful moment, but it felt charged with something unspoken. Every now and then, Cassius caught himself glancing at her, his heart beating faster with each stolen look. Eventually, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the canyon in shadows, they came to a small outcropping. Lyra turned to face him, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than usual. Then, without a word, she stepped closer. Her hand brushed against his as she reached for a rock nearby, the lightest of touches, but enough to make his breath catch. Cassius didn't pull away. Instead, he stood there, feeling the electricity between them. For the first time in days, maybe even years, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel like he was just passing through this world, fixing broken things. With her standing there, her presence pulling him in, he felt like he had finally found something worth staying for. "I can help you, you know," he said softly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I'm good with machines. I can fix things." Lyra's lips curled into a faint smile, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. "I'm not sure you'll need to fix me," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words hung in the air between them, thick with meaning. Cassius didn't know how to respond. Instead, he simply nodded, letting the moment stretch. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the next task, the next job, or the next planet. He was thinking about her. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of quiet. There was a rhythm to their movements, working together, exploring the planet, and learning to navigate its dangers. But the silence between them grew more comfortable, less tense. Cassius had always been alone, always relied on himself, and now, in her presence, he felt something different. Lyra had a way of making him feel seen in ways no one else had. She didn't need to ask him questions, she simply watched, listened, and understood. She didn't judge, and she didn't push. It was like she was waiting for him to catch up, waiting for him to realize what had been there all along. They spent most of their time walking, scanning the terrain, or checking the remaining solar panels. At night, they would sit together around the fire, their conversations few but meaningful. There was something in the way Lyra spoke, each word deliberate, each pause carefully timed, that made him want to listen even more. One night, the sky above was filled with stars, far more vivid than anything Cassius had ever seen. The two of them sat on the ground, the warmth from the fire flickering between them. Cassius glanced over at Lyra, watching her as she stared up at the stars, her expression soft. "I've never seen anything like this," he said quietly. "Back home, the stars always felt so distant. Now, they're so close. So real." Lyra didn't look at him, but her voice was soft when she replied, "I know what you mean. The stars are all we have when we're lost." Cassius felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to ask her about her past, about why she was here, but somehow, it didn't feel like the right time. She had already shared so much with him in the way she looked at him, the way she touched his arm when they passed by each other, the way her smile was both a reassurance and a mystery. "You're not lost," he said softly, turning to face her. "I'm right here." Her gaze shifted toward him, her purple eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. There was something in her look of vulnerability, but also something stronger. She didn't say anything at first, but the quiet between them was enough. Cassius reached out slowly, his hand brushing against hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if on cue, Lyra turned her hand, her fingers intertwining with his. The touch was gentle, but it sent a surge of warmth through his chest. The connection between them was undeniable. It wasn't just the physical touch, it was the way their souls seemed to connect. She had her past, and he had his, but right now, none of that mattered. They were here, in this moment, and it was enough. As the night deepened and the stars overhead shimmered brightly, The two of them sat side by side, hands still joined, feeling the quiet hum of their connection grow stronger. In the silence of the desert, with nothing but the wind and the crackle of the fire, Cassius realized something: he wasn't alone anymore. Not now, not with her beside him. The horizon was painted in hues of deep orange and violet, the twin suns casting long shadows on the rugged landscape. Cassius and Lyra had spent the last few days traversing a more dangerous part of the planet, a coastal region where the air was thick with mist, and the waters were alive with strange, glowing creatures. Despite the beauty of the place, Cassius couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of unease. This world was far more complex than he had ever imagined. "You told me you came here for something," Cassius said, glancing over at Lyra as they walked along a cliffside. "What is it?" She didn't immediately answer. Her long, silvery hair was damp from the mist that hung in the air, and the sight of it drifting in the wind made Cassius' heart race in a way he couldn't quite explain. The strange connection between them had only grown stronger, and the more time he spent with her, the more he found himself captivated not just by her beauty, but by something deeper. Something he couldn't put into words. Lyra stopped walking, her gaze fixed on the glowing horizon. "I was sent here, to study," she said, her voice low, almost distant. "To understand. The energy here, it's different from anything I've ever felt." Cassius frowned, trying to make sense of her words. "Study what?" "This planet. The creatures." She turned to face him, her eyes locked onto his, filled with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Not just the creatures. Everything. The planet itself. Its pulse. Its energy." He shook his head, still struggling to grasp her meaning. "You make it sound like the planet is alive." Her lips curled into a faint, enigmatic smile. "In a way, it is." Cassius couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this world and to Lyra than he could possibly understand. But there was something in the way she looked at him, something in her eyes that told him she wasn't just trying to explain the planet to him. She was telling him something about herself. About who she was and perhaps what she had lost. Suddenly, a loud splash broke the silence. Cassius whipped around to see a massive, bioluminescent creature rising from the water, its fins glowing in the dimming light. It was an impressive sight, and for a moment, Cassius forgot everything else as he stared at it in awe. But then the creature's gaze shifted toward them, its eyes glowing eerily. Without warning, it surged forward, its massive body thrashing through the waves. Lyra stepped forward, her movements quick and fluid. Her eyes glowed faintly as she raised one hand, and for a moment, Cassius thought she was going to attack the creature. But instead, she seemed to be calming it. The creature slowed, its aggressive motions faltering as it floated in front of her, as if waiting for some kind of command. "Is it friendly?" Cassius asked, his voice filled with awe and a hint of disbelief. Lyra nodded, her gaze still fixed on the creature. "Yes. But it's also a reminder. This planet doesn't just take, it gives. You have to understand that. All the energy here, it's connected. It can either help you, or it can destroy you." Cassius felt a strange chill run down his spine. There was something deeply mysterious about Lyra's words, about her connection to this world. He had no idea what it meant, but he knew it was important. And the longer he stayed with her, the more he realized that whatever it was, it would change everything. As the creature swam away into the depths, Lyra turned back to him, her eyes softening as she approached him. There was a moment of silence between them, the air thick with unspoken words. Cassius could feel the heat radiating off her, the way her presence seemed to consume him in a way he hadn't expected. Her hand brushed his, and though it was a light touch, it felt like a spark. A connection. One that ran deeper than just the physical. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hushed, but her words carrying weight. "For what?" Cassius asked, his voice rough, his chest tightening as he turned to face her fully. "For understanding," she said simply, her eyes locking with his once again. "For not running away." Cassius couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, he found himself stepping closer, drawn to her like a moth to a flame. Her presence felt like home, even though he knew it shouldn't. It was like everything he had ever known had led him to this moment, this person. And when their eyes met, all the questions, all the uncertainty, faded away. They stood there for a long moment, neither of them speaking, but everything between them was clear. The pull between them, the energy that had begun to swell around them, nothing could deny it. Without a word, Lyra reached out again, her fingers brushing his arm gently, sending a shiver through his body. Cassius didn't pull away. Instead, he let his hand rest on hers, his heart hammering in his chest. And in that moment, he realized that everything had changed. He wasn't just here to fix broken things anymore. He wasn't just a man stranded on an alien planet. He was part of something much bigger, something that could change not just his life, but the course of everything. But he didn't know where this path would lead. And the more he thought about it, the less he cared. The wind howled louder now, the sky darkening with the ominous clouds of an approaching storm. The twin suns had dipped below the horizon, and the coolness of night settled in. Cassius looked up at the sky, his senses heightened as the air began to hum with an unfamiliar energy. The planet had been calm for days, but now there was a tension in the air that made him uneasy. "You feel that?" Cassius asked, his voice low, as he turned to look at Lyra. She was standing beside him, her long white hair whipping in the wind. Her eyes were focused on the sky, but she didn't need to answer him. Cassius could see it in her posture, the way she was almost bracing herself, as if expecting something to happen. "I do," she said, her voice a whisper, barely audible above the wind. "This planet, it has its moods. And when it gets angry, you'll know." Cassius couldn't help but shiver. He had seen many storms in his life, storms that came with the harsh winds of other worlds, storms that tore through everything in their path. But there was something different about this one. Something more alive. As if the planet itself was trying to communicate something to them. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and a deafening roar filled the air. Cassius barely had time to react before a massive shockwave blasted through the canyon, sending rocks tumbling down the ridge. The sky exploded with flashes of bright light, and the air crackled with a static energy that felt almost tangible. Lyra's hand shot out, grabbing Cassius's arm and pulling him toward a nearby outcropping for shelter. The force of the blast pushed them both to the ground, the air thick with dust and debris. Cassius's heart raced as he scrambled to his feet. His mind was spinning, his body still trying to catch up with the overwhelming chaos around him. He turned to look at Lyra, who was already standing, her expression focused and determined. "This isn't just a storm," she said, her eyes glowing faintly with an otherworldly energy. "This is something else." Cassius could feel the tension in the air, the crackling energy that surrounded them. It was as if the storm was a living entity, alive and aware of their presence. The ground shook again, this time more violently, and Cassius stumbled, his legs buckling beneath him. Lyra was quick to catch him, her hand steady on his shoulder. But even as she held him up, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something dark and unfamiliar. "Lyra?" Cassius asked, his voice shaking. "What's happening?" She didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the horizon as the storm raged around them. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but heavy with a weight Cassius couldn't ignore. "The planet is angry. And it's warning us." Before he could ask her what she meant, the ground beneath them rumbled once more. A massive crack split the earth, sending a wave of dust and debris into the air. The world seemed to shift and warp around them, the storm's fury intensifying with every passing second. Cassius pulled Lyra close, his arms around her as he tried to shield them both from the chaos. He didn't know what to do, where to go. All he could do was hold on to her, his body pressed against hers, feeling the warmth of her skin even through the cold storm. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. The connection between them, the bond that had been growing since they first met, flared to life. It wasn't just the storm that was raging around them, it was the storm inside him, inside them both. He could feel it in the way their bodies reacted to each other, the way her breath quickened when he pulled her closer. The electricity that had started as a spark between them was now a fire, igniting every nerve in his body. Her hands gripped his jacket, and Cassius felt a surge of desire, tempered by the need to protect her. The storm outside was nothing compared to the whirlwind of emotions that now coursed through him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he realized that he wasn't just here to survive. He was here for something more. For someone more. Lyra's eyes met his, and in that moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The chaos, the storm, the planet, it all disappeared. There was only the two of them, standing in the midst of the storm, their bodies pressed together, hearts beating in sync. "I won't let anything happen to you," Cassius whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She didn't answer right away, but the way her body trembled against his told him everything he needed to know. And then, without warning, she leaned in, her lips brushing against his. The kiss was gentle at first, hesitant, as if testing the waters. But as their bodies moved together, the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate. The connection between them grew stronger, the world around them fading into the background as they lost themselves in each other. The storm eventually passed, leaving behind a strange calmness in the air. The wind had died down, and the sky was clearing, though the earth beneath them remained unsettled. The ground was scorched, cracks running through the desert landscape, but they were alive. Cassius and Lyra lay on the ground, the warmth of the fire between them still alive and crackling softly. They had found shelter in the remnants of an old, crumbling structure, a place that had once been a base of operations for someone, long forgotten. Now, it was a refuge from the storm. They didn't speak at first. Instead, they lay there, side by side, their bodies still buzzing from the intensity of the storm and from the kiss they had shared. Cassius's heart was still racing, his mind unable to fully process what had just happened. Lyra's presence next to him was both comforting and unsettling. He wanted to know more about her, about what lay beneath the surface. But for now, they both remained quiet, basking in the lingering energy between them. After a while, Lyra turned to him, her eyes softening in the dim light. "You're still here," she said quietly, her voice a contrast to the storm that had raged earlier. Cassius smiled faintly. "Where else would I go?" She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing his hand in a gesture that was both tender and possessive. "You could leave, if you wanted to," she said, her voice low. "I wouldn't stop you. But I don't want to leave," he whispered, his voice thick with meaning. Not now. Not with you. There was a pause, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved. The world outside was silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for them to make a choice. I'm not afraid of the storm anymore, Lyra said finally, her words steady and sure. Cassius turned his head toward her, his gaze soft. I'm not afraid either, he said, his hand finding hers. And in that moment, they both knew that they weren't just surviving anymore. They were living together. The air was heavy with silence as they walked deeper into the heart of Pandora, their footsteps the only sound beneath the starry sky. The land around them seemed to pulse, the distant hills and valleys alive with the vibrations of the planet. The longer Cassius stayed on this world, the more he felt it, this connection, this almost mystical bond between the land and its inhabitants. Lyra moved ahead, her figure casting a soft glow under the starlight. Her long white hair trailed behind her like a comet's tail, glowing faintly with bioluminescence. Despite the beauty of the landscape, Cassius couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The storm had passed, but it had left behind more than just debris. It had disturbed something in the land, and he could feel it in the air, something ancient, something powerful. Where are we going? Cassius asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Lyra didn't turn to look at him right away, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. We're going to the heart, she said simply. The heart? Cassius repeated, his brow furrowing in confusion. She paused, turning to face him. The faint glow of her eyes shimmered, the purple irises glowing brighter as they locked onto his. The heart of Pandora. The place where everything begins. It's where the energy of this planet converges, where its pulse can be felt the strongest. Cassius was silent for a moment, trying to comprehend her words. And what does it have to do with you? He asked, his voice soft. Lyra smiled faintly, her gaze softening as she stepped closer to him. It's where I belong, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's where I can feel whole again. For a brief moment, Cassius thought he saw something vulnerable in her eyes, something raw and unguarded. It made his chest tighten, a strange sense of protectiveness flooding through him. He had never felt this way about anyone before, certainly not like this. And yet, here he was, drawn to her, wanting to be the one who could make her feel whole again. They continued walking, the landscape around them shifting as they approached the heart of Pandora. The bioluminescent plants grew denser, their glowing stems illuminating the ground beneath them. The air was thick with an almost intoxicating scent, a mix of earth and something sweet, like a promise of something greater. Finally, they reached a clearing, and Cassius stopped in his tracks. Before them stood a massive, ancient structure, tall, graceful, and completely alien. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, its surface shimmering with a soft, ethereal light. The architecture seemed to breathe, as if the very building was alive, pulsing with the same energy that Lyra had spoken of. This is it, Lyra whispered, her voice filled with awe. This is where everything comes together. The heart of Pandora. Cassius felt a shiver run down his spine as he looked at the structure. He couldn't explain why, but something about it felt familiar. It felt like he had been here before, in another lifetime, in another existence. He shook his head, trying to push the feeling aside. Why are we here? He asked, though his voice was barely above a whisper. Lyra stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the shimmering surface of the structure. Because, Cassius, she said softly, this is where we're meant to be. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, a low hum filling the air. Cassius looked down, his heart racing. The energy was building, surging from deep within the planet, and the structure before them seemed to respond. It was as if the very planet had awakened, reacting to their presence. Lyra turned to him, her eyes wide. "Cassius," she said urgently, "the heart is calling us." Without thinking, he reached for her hand. Their fingers intertwined, the warmth of her skin sending a shock through his chest. The pull between them had grown stronger, more undeniable. As their hands touched, a surge of energy pulsed through him, flooding his body with an overwhelming sensation like electricity running through his veins, like fire and water coursing through him at once. Lyra's eyes met his, and in that moment, everything became clear. They were part of this planet, part of this world's heartbeat. The storm, the strange energy, they weren't just coincidences. They were signs. Signs that had led them here, to this moment. "I'm not afraid anymore," Lyra said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of everything they had gone through. "I know who I am now." Cassius squeezed her hand, his heart hammering in his chest. "I'm not afraid either." And in that moment, as the energy of the planet swirled around them, they both understood the truth. Their bond was more than just physical, it was spiritual. They were connected to the land, to the heart of Pandora, and to each other. Cassius and Lyra stood in the center of the clearing, the energy of the planet surrounding them like a living, breathing entity. The air was thick with the pulse of Pandora, a constant hum that vibrated through the ground and into their very souls. "This is it," Lyra whispered, her voice heavy with both awe and fear. "The final test." Cassius turned to her, his heart racing. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. Lyra's gaze softened, and for the first time, Cassius saw the vulnerability beneath the surface. "This is the moment where everything will either fall into place or fall apart," she said, her voice barely audible. "The planet will test us. It will test our connection, our bond. If we're strong enough, if we truly belong here, it will show us the way." Cassius felt the weight of her words, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't know if he was ready for this, but one thing was certain: he wasn't about to leave her now. No matter what the planet threw at them. The ground beneath them trembled once more, the hum of the energy growing louder. Then, as if the planet itself was breathing, the structure before them began to shift. The walls seemed to ripple and melt, revealing a swirling vortex of light and energy in the center. Lyra reached out toward it, her hand trembling. "We have to go," she said urgently, her voice filled with both excitement and fear. Cassius took her hand, pulling her toward the vortex. "Together," he said, his voice firm with determination. They stepped into the vortex, and in an instant, the world around them shifted. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the energy of Pandora engulfing them in a whirlwind of light and color. Cassius could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was a sense of belonging, of knowing that, no matter what came next, they were in this together. The vortex swirled around them, a blinding whirl of light and energy that seemed to stretch both time and space. Cassius's heart pounded in his chest, his mind reeling from the intensity of the sensation. He felt like he was being torn apart and remade at the same time, like his very being was being rewritten by the planet itself. Beside him, Lyra's hand remained in his, her grip tight but steady. The energy surged between them, pulsing like a second heartbeat that they both shared. The connection was undeniable, stronger than anything Cassius had ever felt. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something spiritual. They were connected in ways that words could never describe. Suddenly, everything stopped. The vortex vanished, and they were left standing in a vast, empty space. The ground beneath their feet was soft and smooth, as if they were standing on the surface of a giant, glowing crystal. The sky above them was a deep shade of violet, the stars twinkling brightly. But what caught Cassius's attention was the figure standing before them. A tall, ethereal being, its form glowing with a soft, pulsating light. It was humanoid, but not quite human. Its skin shimmered with an iridescent sheen, and its eyes were the same glowing purple as Lyra's. It was an otherworldly presence, ancient and wise, yet somehow familiar. "This is the heart," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling with reverence. "This is what I came here for." Cassius's throat tightened. What is this place?" Lyra stepped forward, her hand still holding his. "This is the source of all energy on Pandora. It's the consciousness of the planet itself." The being in front of them raised a hand, and Cassius felt an overwhelming wave of energy crash into him. It wasn't painful, but it was all-consuming, like a flood of knowledge and emotion. He saw flashes of memories, fragments of a past he couldn't fully grasp. The being was showing him things, the history of Pandora, the struggles of its people, and the ancient bond between the planet and Lyra's species. The being's voice echoed in his mind, deep and resonant. "You are not here by accident," it said. "You, Cassius, are part of the planet's plan. You and Lyra share a bond that has existed long before your time. You are here to heal what has been broken." Cassius staggered back, overwhelmed by the information flooding his senses. "What do you mean?" he gasped, his chest tight. The being's gaze softened, and Lyra stepped forward, her expression a mix of awe and acceptance. "The planet has been waiting for us," she said softly. "Pandora is dying, Cassius. The storms, the strange energy there, the planet's cry for help. But it cannot heal itself alone. It needs us." Cassius looked at Lyra, her eyes filled with a deep sadness he hadn't seen before. She was strong, resilient, but in this moment, he saw a vulnerability he hadn't fully understood until now. This wasn't just about survival, it was about the future of the planet, and her connection to it. "The bond we share is the key to Pandora's survival," Lyra continued. "It's not just about me, or you. It's about all of us, all the life on this world. The energy that flows through Pandora can heal, but it needs our strength. Together, we can restore balance." Cassius's mind raced. He had never thought of himself as a hero, never imagined he would be part of something so grand. He was just a man, stranded on a planet far from home, trying to do his job. But now, standing here, with Lyra by his side, he knew he couldn't walk away. He couldn't leave her. Not now, not when the fate of everything they had come to care for was at stake. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice firm. Lyra turned to face him, her eyes bright with a mix of hope and fear. "We make the planet whole again. We unlock the energy that's been trapped, and we set it free." Cassius nodded, his heart swelling with determination. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing: he couldn't do this without her. They were bound to each other, bound to this planet, and together, they would fight to restore what had been broken. The being before them nodded, as if sensing their resolve. "The path will not be easy. The storms you have faced are only the beginning. But together, you will face them. And together, you will save Pandora." The energy around them pulsed one final time, and the vision began to fade. As the light dimmed, Cassius felt the weight of the mission ahead of them. But he also felt something else, a deep, unshakable sense of connection to Lyra, to the planet, and to the future they were about to create together. The world around them returned to normal, the soft glow of the stars above, the hum of energy still resonating through the land. They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the being's words hanging heavy between them. The wind had calmed, the storm seemed to have receded, but the journey ahead of them was just beginning. Cassius turned to Lyra, his eyes meeting hers. There was no need for words, everything had been said. They had been chosen for something greater, something beyond themselves. And together, they would face it. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile, her eyes glowing with a quiet confidence. "I've always been ready." Cassius reached for her hand, feeling the familiar warmth of her skin as their fingers intertwined. The bond between them had deepened, stronger than ever. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about rebuilding, restoring, and finding their place in a world that was so much bigger than either of them could have imagined. The stars above them shimmered brightly, and as they turned to face the future, Cassius felt a new sense of purpose flood his chest. They would not be passive observers. They would be active participants in the restoration of Pandora. Together, they would make sure that the storm never came again. Together, they would build a future not just for themselves, but for everything they had come to love. And with that, they began their journey, hand in hand, towards a new beginning. They had crossed worlds, fought storms, faced the unthinkable, and yet, when they finally stood together at the edge of the galaxy, the only thing that remained was one question: what now? Cassius and Lyra had defied the laws of nature, torn apart the very fabric of space-time to be together. Their bond, a love that transcended everything they thought they knew, had become the catalyst for something much greater. But now, as the stars above them began to burn brighter than ever, the weight of the universe pressed on their shoulders. What would become of them? Because love, it isn't just something you feel. It's something you become. And in that final moment, when the cosmic forces aligned and Pandora itself seemed to hum in unison with their hearts, Cassius realized that the true test was never about surviving the impossible. It was about understanding the cost of loving someone who isn't human, who isn't from your world, who doesn't just change your life, they change the course of everything. So now, here's the most important question: can love be the key to salvation or the catalyst for destruction? Is love worth the cost? Can you trust it when it comes from the stars? Can you trust it when the universe has its own plans? The journey may be over, but the questions remain. And if you've made it this far, I have a question for you: are you ready to dive deeper into the unknown with us? If so, don't forget to subscribe to Intergalactic Hearts, where the universe of love is just beginning to unfold. You, my friend, are now part of something truly extraordinary. Don't let it slip away. Share your thoughts in the comments below, tell us what you think, and let's uncover the mysteries of love, one galaxy at a time. This is just the beginning. The true adventure starts now.